Hi, this is a quick tip on how you can set the default window size with the mpv player. So the mpv player is a command line program that's available sort of cross-platform, and what you can do is set the default window size of the videos that you open. So if I open a video here, you can see it's opening in the center of the window and it's set to about 33%. So this is useful if, for instance, you're using a tiling window manager. You can set this to appear on every screen, so you've kind of got a little pop-up video where you can watch your video in multiple screens. What I'm going to do is show you how you can set the window size so that it's, for instance, 33% or 50% and always centered in the middle of your screen. So if you come across to your mpv config file, if I switch back to the terminal a second, if you look in your home directory, config mpv, you'll see there is a mpv.config file. In this file, you can ignore these sections. These top three sections are basically just for my setup. This next one down here, you can actually set the format used with YouTube DL and mpv player. So you can set mpv player not to open 4K videos. For instance, if you've got a lower powered machine, you might only want to set it to open stuff at 1080p. So what you can do is, not to get too sidetracked, but you can set the height and the frame rate and the video codec. So you can say don't have VPN 9, for instance, and have the best audio. So this is, for instance, how I set mpv not to open really large videos on a lower powered machine. But down here is the section I wanted to get to, and that's for starting a video in the center at a specific geometry. So for instance, if I change this to 50% and then switch back to the terminal and play another video, I forgot the percent symbol, so if I save that and switch back across, you can see now that's come up at 50% of the screen. You can see here, if I move that, you can see that's 50%. Yeah. So that will set it so it always comes up at 50% in the middle of your screen. You could, of course, set it to anything, 20%, a really tiny one if you want, but I find 33% is quite handy because, as I say, I can then move this up here, and if I remember the key combination, set it to appear on multiple windows. So when I'm working, I can work away here and have the video playing. And in DWM, the window manager I'm using, the keyboard shortcut is Shift Super Control to set the and the number of the tag that you're going to set it to. So you can see here this video, when I've got that moused over, you can see, if you look in the top left of the screen, you can see 2 and 3 both have white squares next to them, and that's indicating that this video is tagged for 2 and 3. Tags are like sort of workspaces in DWM, and if I press Shift Super Control and 2, that will remove it from this tag and it will just be present on this one over here. So that's getting a bit sidetracked, but that's how I use mpv player with a tiling window manager to always open the video bang in the center of the screen at 33% so that I can, you know, move it up here. Of course I can then just, as soon as it opens, I could just press F to toggle it full screen. That's just how I like to have videos opened, because you might have lots of different videos, some small, some, you know, 1080p or something, and sometimes you open a video from the command line and it takes over your entire screen, and you know, you can't see what you're working on, and you know, you have to sort of quit it, or you know, switch back, or you're trying to switch back and the video's still playing. So that's why I quite like having a small little window that launches, and I can easily toggle it full screen. And the other really nice thing is it actually toggles back to the size you originally set the geometry to. So for instance, if I come across and set this to 50%, and then switch back, it should toggle back to that size when I press F to go full screen. So it's also very useful, as I said, because you might have really big videos and you launch it, it's, you know, taking up your whole screen here and you can't see what you're doing, and it's obscuring other stuff in your desktop. So this is just a nice way to use MPV to have it all open, all your videos at consistent size, so you know, you're not suddenly opening a small one, a big one, a small one, a big one, and you know, not get in the way too much. And then you've still got the option of going full screen, and you know, if you're using a tiling window manager, you can, you know, do this sort of stuff. And this is quite, to get a bit sidetracked about tiling window managers, this is actually what I found the best layout for watching videos is, because one thing people don't mention about tiling window managers is when you open a video on the command line, as I just did here, it's going to have two windows. It's going to have two terminal windows. The window you opened the file from, and the actual video file. So whenever you're viewing a video, you're going to have two terminal windows open, and you can, if I set this to, for instance, move to another thing and open a thing here, when using a tiling window manager and you've only got two windows, the video will actually be sort of located down here, which isn't really very watchable, I find. So I prefer to have the video, as I say, like this, so it's always up in the top right, and you've actually got the controls here. The other thing is you can't actually do away with this window when you launch a video. You can't, if you were to put this in the background when you launch it, for instance, and if you were to put that in the background, I could type with an ampersand. Sure. I mean, if I then try and close this window here, you have running jobs. Okay, so I can't close this window even though I put this in the background, because if I do, that will kill that window. So you end up having to have two windows open when you open a video with a tiling window manager. And then say you're going to want this, I'll switch back here. I find this is the most convenient sort of layout for watching videos with a tiling window manager, other than having a little, you know, floating window, which can sometimes get in the way. If I'm actually wanting to watch a film or, you know, something, this is the most sort of convenient way, you know, to work. And you can open, you know, open something up, but that's getting a bit sidetracked. But that's basically one way you can use the settings in MPV to adjust the size. So again, if I come across to the config, you could have 66%. And you can see it's now opening, really large. So if you wanted a really, by default, big window come up, you can do that. But as I said, one thing, when you're launching videos from the command line, you're always going to have two windows, and you're not really going to be using a file manager if you're using a tiling window manager, because it doesn't really make sense. So you're not going to have, whatever the tiling window, the file manager called Nautilus or whatever in Linux, and be clicking files to opening them. You're probably going to be doing stuff on the command line. So that's why it's quite handy to be able to set the default size of the videos so that they always open the same size. And just on a side note about DWM, if I come across to my build, you actually have to set DWM to have mpv as a floating window. See here in DWM, we got this rule here for mpv player is floating 1, and that sets it so that in the mpv player it's always going to be launched as a floating window like this, rather than as a window like this, which I'd find a bit jarring. If you're sort of working, you open a video and it shifts all your stuff across, can be a bit jarring. So that's why it's easier to have a floating window with DWM. Otherwise, by default, it's going to open as a tiled window. And if you then change the settings in the mpv config file, you can have it pop up just at at the right size for you. Move it up there, and I can then tag it for multiple windows here, so that I can switch across and the videos on every screen. So that's how you can set the geometry of windows that mpv has opened, to play a video, just by changing the config file. Come across. That is one side note there. One thing I have noticed is if you've got a floating window and you're switching tags in DWM, the floating window will have focus, not the window here. So let me just show that again, because that's one thing I have sort of noticed. See up here, this is selected, and you can see as I mouse over, you can see the window title here changes. So that's the ST terminal selected, and that's the video in the floating window. When I switch across to another tag, even if I move here, if I move across here, every time I switch across to another tag, this window has got focus and not this one. So what can happen sometimes when you're using DWM is you switch across to a tag with a float, and you've got a floating window, and you think you're starting typing in a document, but you're actually pressing keys into mpv player. So when you switch tags, what you frequently have to do is kind of mouse across, or there are keyboard shortcuts. But if I quit that and come back across to the mpv config file, the other thing is, as I was mentioning, you can set the format that YouTube DL uses. YouTube DL's kind of works in conjunction with mpv player to play a lot of stuff, and in the mpv config file, as I said, you can set the audio and video formats and codecs that you want, or want to reject. So for instance, as I said, you can set it to always use videos that are 1080p or less, rather than opening a 4K video with MPV, which might cause your system to, slow down a bit. So that's basically how you can set the video height. You can also set the frame rate. So another thing that happens is people might put up screen recordings and they're at 60 frames a second. At 1080p, and it's just too much for your system. So I've got this set so that it always uses like 30 frames, so that I know it's gonna not overload the system. So that's the mpv config file, and it may be in a different location. I know it's on a different location on the Mac and on Windows, so you'll have to have a look at where the location of that file is on those operating systems. But on Linux and Unix, it's in .config mpv.config, and there's lots of settings you can put in there. One I put up here is the message level ffmpeg equals fatal, and that basically suppresses a lot of error messages that you might get in MPV that aren't critical, that just spam your terminal with a lot of stuff. And the other thing is you can set the hardware encoding, so you can make sure that MPV players using hardware encoding and decoding rather on Linux and Unix. And actually, one thing I did notice that I did have to set on Unix, I can't remember if I had to set it on Linux as well, to get hardware acceleration working. In my ZSHRC file, I've got this setting which sets the XDG runtime directory to temp. There's if I come across to my temp folder, somewhere or other in here, I think it's probably only when MPV is actually playing. What it does is it creates a sort of a runtime folder in the temp directory so that MPV player can get hardware acceleration, that's it, working on Unix and Linux. I can't remember where I found that fix. It might have been somewhere like the Arch Linux repository wiki. But that's just another note I've come across with MPV and Linux and Unix, and getting hardware acceleration working properly. So that's how you can change the geometry of Windows with MPV. A couple of notes about using MPV with DWM, setting a floating window, and the XDG runtime directory setup that I needed to do to get hardware acceleration working.